Welcome, folks. Did anyone have trouble getting in? I did get an email from somebody saying they were having trouble accessing the webinar. Just want to make sure that's not universal. Folks are getting in, so.
Yeah.
Okay, super, 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 super. If anybody has the link for the webinar, they can drop into the chat. I think the link I have is for co-hosts, and I'm sorry, I cannot figure out how to get the actual attendee link. So if somebody can drop that into chat for me, I can send it over to Randy. We're going to give folks a minute to come in. Lori said she had to verify several times. Okay, I don't know. I should not be trying to help anybody with their tech issues. That should not be me.
Thank you, Hassan.
Okay. Do you want to send that to Randy Sedona?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, we'll give folks another minute to get in and then we'll get started. How's everybody today? It is sunny and warm in Pittsburgh. Yay.
Yay.
We are very excited. Normally it is cold and rainy or snowy. If you all want to drop your name, your organization, where you are in the world, if you aren't with an organization, especially where you are, that'd be great. Love to see who's here, get a sense of where folks are coming from. We're really excited to share the speaker with everybody today. Hi, Hassan at We Don't Waste. How's Colorado today? Is Denver warm? You guys are up in the mountains. Wonderful. California, Georgia, awesome. Washington, very exciting. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you can go to the next, okay. So just a few reminders as we go. Drop your questions into the Q&A. If you put them in the chat, there's a pretty good chance they will scroll on by and we'll miss them. So if you want to make sure your questions get answered, put them in the Q&A. This is being recorded. We will send the link to the presentation in a couple of days. So you'll be able to go back if you missed something or want to share it with somebody, you can watch it later. And then at the end of the webinar, we will provide our usual links. We are on our fourth lesson, our fourth in the series of how to start a food rescue. So we've talked about, an introduction, why you should do it, funding, super important, food donors, and now we're going to talk about distributing food. And this is the one that catches people off guard. I think a lot of times when you start doing food rescue, you think, there's already an infrastructure in place on where I'm going to distribute food. I'm going to take it to the local food pantry. And invariably, if you're scaling food recovery, you're probably going to run into some issues on that. So let's go to the next slide. Joining us today is Michelle Sandidge. Michelle Sandidge has been working with 412 Food Rescue in Pittsburgh since 2016 as in her position as the Chief Community Affairs Officer at the Pittsburgh Housing Authority, or the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh, as it's actually called. And Michelle recently joined our board. We absolutely love Michelle. She's a great storyteller. We get a lot of great information from her and have learned so much from her over the years on how to do better in terms of distribution and serve the community better. Next. So as I've said probably till I'm blue in the face, and you're tired of hearing me say it, but I'm going to keep saying it, that successfully scaling food recovery requires thinking through the logistics of pickup and the logistics of distribution. And again, it's that logistics of distribution side that tends to be what people fail to realize they're going to have to do, or they get caught by surprise. We certainly did. Next. Um, you know, about 80 to 90% of the food that is rescued is fresh food, it's perishable. Um, Whereas about 40 to 50%, about 40 to 50% of it is produce. That food needs to get where it's going quickly. Um, it will not wait to be distributed. It comes in various sizes, so it can be unpredictable how big a donation is going to be or how small. We get 10,000 pounds of cucumbers from one place and a tray of sandwiches from another. Food waste also happens 7 days a week. It is not something that is restricted to a schedule or that can be regulated or to just 1 or 2 days a week. There's a variable overall volume of food. So again, that 10,000 pounds of cucumbers isn't going to happen every day. It's going to surprise you. You need to be able to figure out how you're going to distribute that when that happens. And then finally, there is a focus on zero waste. So we want to make sure that when we distribute food to a nonprofit to hand out, that it's actually going to help them, it's going to get used, and it's going to get to people in time to use it. We can't just drop it off somewhere and be like, well, if it gets used, great. If not, whatever. They had the option. Next. The solution is a flexible distribution network that goes beyond the traditional charitable food system. Every single organization that is doing food recovery at scale will tell you they have organizations that are receiving food that are not food pantries. Food pantries are a part of it, but it has to go beyond that. And you get that flexibility when you work with organizations that their main job is not distributing food, it's providing some other service to people who might be secure. So they are working different hours than a traditional food pantry. They're supported by funds and functions that are separate, meaning they're oftentimes there all the time, or at least 5 days a week during business hours. When it comes to things like subsidized housing and housing authorities, there are people there 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to want a food distribution at 2 a.m., but it does mean that your 6 p.m. Saturday donation might have somewhere to go. Then there's other types of programs. There's other types of programs. We work with Head Start programs. We work with WIC offices, job training centers. Again, anywhere that is already working with people who are food insecure is a great location for distribution. And that was sort of something that a lot of food recovery organizations fall into in sort of like purely out of self-defense. What am I going to do with all these cucumbers? Well, you've got a housing site that has 500 families. Great. Can I interest you in 1,000 pounds of cucumbers? You're not going to be able to take that to a traditional access point. Same thing with Saturday and Sunday distributions. And so some of your best partnerships are going to be those non-traditional outlets. And again, I will sing from the rafters and preach this till honestly, till the day I die, that you want to work with your housing authority. You want to work with your local housing authority because they are going to be your best partners. And I think we can use that too as a model on how to create a successful distribution program that allows you to minimize waste, right? Because you got a lot of different places to take it. You had a lot of different days that they're open. It can absorb a variety of different sizes, amounts, and types of food. And it also is going to make a huge difference to that community. It's going to help you really make some impact and understand what the impact of food recovery is. So I'm so grateful for Michelle being here today to talk through this because I want to talk about what it's like to actually be on her side of it, to start this food distribution program. It's not your main job. I assume you had to go to your boss at some point, Michelle, and say, "Hey, I've got this crazy idea."
Mhm.
Um, and you made it work. So maybe you can help others know how to do that in their communities. So So the first question I'm going to ask you is, how can they sell this idea to potential partners, whether it's housing or something else?
So this idea usually goes a long way if you have groups of residents, tenant leaders in your communities as it relates to housing authorities, or just whoever is the key organizer for that community. So let's say it's not a housing authority that you are connecting with, but maybe you're connecting with a community group. Well, you want the organizers who bring kind of ideas and uh, creative things to the table for the community. And that's essentially what we did. We have a resident advisory board. We have a number of residents who are the key figures in their communities. And so that's where we initially pitched it. And we started with one of our high rise communities, one of the ones that was really active in their building. And we talked to them, talked about the concept, got buy-in from them. Once you get buy-in from some, tenant group or whoever the community group is in the community that you're in, and you get buy-in from them, they are your source of marketing. While the housing authority, we did a whole lot of marketing as it related to going various places, but we utilized the residents from that high-rise community to talk about their experience. It was wonderful. It was great. Other people got jealous. We had lots of good pictures, lots of good stories. And the next thing we know, everybody's asking, well, when are they coming to my community? How long does it take? What can we do? How can we get them there? So you start small and, all of a sudden you get everybody involved based on what happens with that one entity or two. And then you just make everybody else jealous. And then everybody jumps on board.
So now, do you think that advice carries if the housing authority itself is reluctant? Like, how do you, because you've been with me, you
Mm-hmm.
traveled with me to a couple locations to talk
Correct.
to other housing authorities, and they're not always super excited to implement this. How do you get through that first barrier?
So I think the key is to be able to go to people, not so much going to the administration of whatever the housing authority is, but the actual locations where you're going to be delivering food. That's the key. Because you really want to talk to them because while we are 24/7, open, we don't live there. Housing authority staff doesn't live there. And so
Right.
you really need the resident buy-in because they may, the staff is gone at 4, 5, 6 o'clock or whatever. They're still going to be there. They may actually be the volunteers who are going to come, when the truck shows up or the car shows up and, brings the food in, set it up, tell people in the building, hey, today's a day, or all of a sudden we've got, a food drop here. Are you interested? So you really want to connect with whoever is, I'll say, your tenant leaders or your leaders of that community. And every community is different. I always tell people what works in one high rise or one family community may not work in another. So you really want to talk to them because we have several different communities here. We have 11 high rises and 5 family communities. One of our communities has a strong Somali Bantu population. So the needs of that community as it relates to food may differ from our high rise that's predominantly Russian Jewish. And so, of course, you're not going to be bringing anything that they don't eat. If it's not kosher or if it's pork or something of that nature, you're going to waste your time bringing that and it's just going to sit there and they're not going to utilize it. So you really have to know the pulse of who lives there, what their food likes and dislikes are. It would be easy if you were a big old grocery store because you would have a plethora of stuff sitting out, but you don't. So you got to really be strategic in how you deliver and what you offer.
But for the food recovery organizations, while they may not be a grocery store, but they tend to be working with a lot of variety of food sources, right? So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so while again, this is what's so interesting is that it's in some ways it's like like I say, it's self-defense, right? It's your own self-interest. If I got a donation of halal meat, for example,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sure, maybe I could throw that anywhere, but I also then have a location that is really looking for halal meat versus
Mm-hmm.
if I get a donation of pork, that's not going to go over very well in that community. But
Correct.
I have a location that is going to have a barbecue with that, all that,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're going
Mm-hmm.
to be super excited about that. And so it actually fits really well with that food recovery model, that sort of hyper local placement within those various housing communities.
Mhm. You have to know your audience, and I always say that if you know your audience, you really it's 412 has never been like a cookie cutter where, oh, we have a bunch of strawberries, we're just going to give everybody strawberries. All of a sudden, through the years, we figured out what communities like strawberries or bananas. I went to one of our high rises and they were like, "We're inundated. It's too many bananas. We like bananas, but we don't like them that much." And so you've got to figure out, okay. And this was a bunch of seniors, and I'm like, "Oh, they're gonna start throwing the bananas at us in a minute." And they were like, "Too many. It's just too many. We don't want." Not that they didn't want them, but the amount of them they didn't want. And that was a smaller high rise. And so we had to figure out, wait a minute, if you've got a big bunch of bananas that you're delivering or a bunch of, some kind of produce and whatnot, take it to a larger location. Don't just drop it all off at a smaller location because it's just going to sit there.
Yeah, I think back to, and this was actually a county housing site, but it illustrates what you're talking about. We get number 10 cans, right? Everybody gets number 10 cans donated, the big, like,
Mm-hmm.
giant ones. We had those of black olives. Ugh, I mean, who wants a number 10 can of black olives? But in the high rise on the south side that is primarily Russian immigrants, they were fighting over that. They really wanted those number 10 cans of black olives. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's what's so beautiful about working with these different organizations is you can find a home for even sometimes really otherwise unpopular.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of getting on board, what I hear you saying is that uh, get hyper local and understand the needs of the communities. Talk to organizations, talk to housing sites until you find one that is willing to be your demonstration project. And then you can show what the impact is going to be, which then will help you sell it both to the administration as well as to other sites.
Correct. That is, I mean, to go to the administration, and sometimes it is red tape, and you got to get approval. But if you go directly to the residents who are going to approve it anyway, and you talk with them, and there's a tenant leadership, or there's a community group leaders, or whatever they are, and they say yes, start small. And then once you have some statistics, some numbers, some pictures, some people who are going to be your marketing folks, even though they don't know that they're marketing, but they're saying great stuff about what they get and how they get it, you're in. And the administration can't say no because, of course, it worked someplace else. They know, the administrative people know, if it worked there, why can't it work someplace else? And other residents feel the same way.
And I think this probably is, you can extrapolate from housing sites to other sort of non-traditional distribution sites as well. If you can find
Mm-hmm.
one job training site, one veterans program, one Head Start program that is willing to think outside the box and kind of experiment with this, and be your demonstration, others will see the impact and be
Mm-hmm.
willing to try it.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you a little bit more nitty gritty. You've already given some tips for success with working with housing. Um, what are some other things that people need to know going in? So far, what I've heard is really understand the needs of the community so you're not taking them things they don't want. What else?
So I mean that's the big thing is that each community is a little bit different. The volunteer network will be different. In some communities, the residents will volunteer, so you'll know that, and they'll be there when the truck comes or the car comes with the food drop. But in some areas, you don't have any enough volunteers, or you just don't have any, and so that's when you institute the administrative people from the housing authority or from the entity where you're delivering to be a part of what's going on. And so you get them, it's kind of like, how do you call it? Like the United Way used to have people who would do things. Just for like the day of caring. But
Yeah.
so what it is, it's the same concept. It's that now the organization embraces what's going on. So even if you don't have enough volunteers, you figure we've got a lot of high rises and locations. And you would always think, oh, there's a lot of people there and they have a lot of folks and a lot of people are volunteering. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And some of the folks, while our high rises are senior and persons with disabilities, they may not be up to the challenge, physically to be able to do this, and they just don't want to do it. And so that's when the administration steps in and says, well, hey, if this other high rise and they have volunteers and they're getting food and food insecurity has become eradicated, because of this, we need to make sure that it happens someplace else. And so then the administration should kick in and say, let's get some volunteers or some folks who are working during that time to be able to participate. And that's how it really worked for our authority. We got volunteers from staff, and then we also had staff who were working during that time. And it's one of those things where once you get people to volunteer and they see what they're volunteering to do, you get a lot of other people saying, hey, I want to volunteer and do the same thing. And the produce, it really is good. It's fresh. And folks are like, oh, I want to be a part of this. This is a good thing.
So again, I hear one thing is don't let the ideal or the perfect or the prescribed methodology be the enemy of the accomplished.
Correct.
Right? In other words, if you think, okay, well, this is the way it should work, and then you have a site that can't do that, don't write them off. Look for
Nope.
another way through it.
No, you've got to adapt to the location. And like I said, every location may not have volunteers. And so you need a network of some volunteers who could come to that location. So for instance, here at the Housing Authority, where we don't have enough residents to do, pick up the food and distribute the food and we have staff that'll offset. And they may come from a different area. That's not their area where they're assigned, but they're just coming for the 412 food rescue drop that's going to happen at that time.
Yeah. And I know that that's actually also, in some cases, been helpful because especially when it's our truck delivering, there might actually be some leftovers and that staff is able to help distribute that to other
Correct.
sites. Although frankly, I know your residents do too, which is amazing. Like they find a home for that food.
Oh yeah.
They will call their sisters or whoever it is that they need to
Mm-hmm.
call to make sure that food gets somewhere, which is
Mm-hmm.
incredible. Um, do you provide a written guideline to those organizations, or do you empower them to figure it out? If you have a resident site that's distributing.
So we do have guidelines as it relates to who's going to work, who's going to be there from our staff. We know exactly what tenant leaders are going to, or not so much just tenant leaders, I should say, because every community does not have an active tenant council, but they do have some tenants who are in volunteer and leadership positions. They don't have like a president, vice president, all that. Those are the real structured tenant councils. But there are some folks in some communities who just are part of the volunteer network. They like, they like to be involved. They don't want to have a title or anything, but they want to be able to help, distribute food, tell people about food distribution. If there's, some cool things that 412 will be doing, like classes to show you how to cook or, how to go shopping, things of that nature. They're getting the word out. And they're necessarily not, your tenant council group, but they're tenant leaders or volunteers who really want to be a part of it. So you have to, like I always say, you got to know your audience, and each community is different. And it's not just public housing, but every community is different.
Yeah.
And so you can't roll in there and say, oh, this is what we do over here, and it better work over here, because it may not work. It may not be the same volunteer spirit. It may not be the same food needs. It may not be the same terrain, because you may be able to drop the stuff right off at the front door you may have to schlep it from the car or the truck around the corner and carry it. And so
Right.
you need to be able to figure that one out as well.
And so that's something that a food rescue organization could potentially work with the partners on, is
Hmm.
helping them think about what implementation guidelines would look like, how to create processes that work. But again, what I'm hearing is that it's really important that you don't go in and lay down the law, but you actually work with the organization to make sure that you're creating processes and procedures that work for that nonprofit.
Correct, correct. Every nonprofit and every location for a nonprofit, if it's the veterans that you're delivering and they have two or three different locations, one location is not going to be the same as the other. I can guarantee you.
Yep.
So it's kind of like going to a grocery store. Every grocery store might have the same groceries, but they're presented in a different way. I can guarantee, because if I go, our store here is Giant Eagle. If I go to a Giant Eagle anywhere other than the one that I normally go to, I'm walking around like, because you're lost, because it's set up different. And it's set
Right.
up in a way that meets the needs of the community where it's located. And that's the same thing that you have to do with your food drops.
Yeah. Okay, great. Um, Next one, next slide. So now I'm going to ask you for some fun stuff because you have the best stories about what the impact from these partnerships can be like. And there's some questions below about how to convince folks or what kind of numbers we're looking for. And I think that the type of sort of qualitative stories that you have are some of the most profoundly convincing uh, uh, information to get somebody to think, okay, this might be a good thing. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the impact that you've seen from food distributions in the communities that the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh manages.
So when we started down this road, the housing authority had, and we still do, had a food fund. It was a minimal amount of money that comes out of employees' paychecks every 2 weeks. It was like $2 or something monthly. So we have roughly 500 employees, and if even half of them participate, that's a decent amount of money every month that's going into the food fund. And what we had recognized when we started with 412 was that the food fund, we would go to the food fund and we would have, residents who would be in need of food and all of the good stuff. And we weren't utilizing the food fund, and it was just sitting there and growing and growing. And so what we recognized was that 412 had come along and helped us eradicate hunger in public housing within, I don't know, maybe 6 months. And so the food fund, as I said, it still continues now. And we decided, well, we're just not going to sit on the money and just, keep collecting and collecting it. So we were able to give a sizable portion of that to 412 Food Rescue to buy a truck to assist in what they're doing. And so that was one of the really cool things that happened. But the other thing was that we also noticed, why I said we had, in 6 months, we eradicated, food insecurity in public housing thanks to 412. We also noticed a kind of collective camaraderie that was happening when the food drops were taking place. And this was before COVID. There was a lot of social isolation and things of that nature, especially in our high rises. I mean, seniors get in a building and they may or may not interface. They don't come out. They don't, they just don't get involved. And so we were looking for mechanisms to get people to come out and to talk to others and share stories and, recipes and ideas. And the number one thing we started thinking about was, if you ever think of your personal life, things happen around food. I mean, in your house, wherever you go, people are always congregating in the kitchen. You got a whole bunch of rooms of, where you could be, but everybody's around the food. And so we figured that out when we had the very first food drop in one of our high rises, that for some reason it was like a calling card, for folks to come out of their buildings and get food, and then they could see their neighbors. So that was happening in the high rises. And so we just took the same, energy and did it in our family communities. And what happened with them was the seniors in the family communities were now communicating with the young people in the family communities, and they were sharing stories, talking about recipes. At one point in time, 412 dropped off a roast. If you know how a roast looks, that's a piece of meat. You look at it. If you really don't know what it is, you're like, that, I don't want that. That's just, it's big. It's not cute. I'll say that. And
It's
so,
not.
my best story with that was that there was a young woman and an elderly woman there. And the young woman is saying, "Oh, no, I don't want that. I don't know what that is. That's an ugly piece of meat. I'm not taking it." And the older woman says to her, "You've got that smartphone. You take a picture and I'm going to tell you exactly how to cook this roast." And she walks her through it. She's exchanging recipes and whatnot. The next time they encounter each other, that young woman hugs that older woman. I thought she was going to squeeze her like a piece of meat. And she's just holding on to her. She says, "We had roast for a couple of days. I can't believe it. It was a couple of days. Thank you for the recipe." And that said to us, I think this is something that's going to bring families and communities together. So the same thing happened with one of our communities. It's rich with our Somali Bantu population. And so of course Americans, we like the food to look a certain way. If it's like a little bruise, we're like, "Oh no, we don't want that." And from our Somali Bantu population, they're like, "There's nothing wrong with that. It's very good. You can." And so they started sharing information with their American counterparts on what to do with, yams, and what to do with fruit that we say, "Oh, no, that's ugly bruised fruit." Next thing you know, they're sharing recipes and different types of recipes, which was great. And then the other thing is, Americans, hope there's nothing but Americans on here so I can talk about us, but we are a very spoiled group of people. And of course, when we show up, we want a bag. Or this would be before bringing your own bag to a store. And we show up to 412 and everybody's fussing. "Oh, I can. It's too much. I don't have a bag. I can't carry it." In the world of the Somali Bantus, they taught the residents how to utilize your clothing as a source to be able to, transport food. So I'm in a community. I just got a new smartphone and didn't know what I was doing with it. And I'm standing in the middle of the street and I see the Somali Bantu residents and the American residents carrying potatoes in their on their heads in some kind of wraps that they had made and in their clothing. And I'm getting ready to get hit by a car because I'm trying to capture this moment. So I'm like, I cannot believe. And they're like, "They taught us how to carry stuff." And it was incredible, but it's a really good just lesson on how you are so spoiled, Americans, but somebody can teach you exactly how to utilize whatever you have. It's kind of like, I call it the MacGyver theory. All of a sudden, somebody taught you exactly what to use, what you had, and you made it work. And we didn't have any potatoes left over, needless to say, nor did we have bags at that time. So it was a really cool experience. I love that story. Those two stories are my favorites because it really showed us exactly the impact of what can happen when you bring people together around food.
They're my favorite too. There's a possibility some people on this call have heard that story because I tell both of those all the time, especially the pot roast, because I believe
Yeah.
she had like taken pictures of
Oh
it.
yeah.
And,
Yeah.
it really, food is a connector. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Food is something that brings people together. And,
Mm-hmm.
normally we go to the grocery store or we have it dropped at our doorstep or we, are going to a food pantry and we're not necessarily connecting with our neighbors over the
Mm-hmm.
food. And having those food distributions in the housing communities creates an entirely new mechanism for community building, which is such a
Mm-hmm.
powerful, powerful impact of food rescue, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
And
Go
we
ahead.
had another thing that we did many, many years ago. We did recipes, from various residents, and we shared the recipes with a number of our tenant groups so that they would have, and it was different recipes, with what you can make with fresh, because a lot of food that Americans get, it's processed, it's microwavable, but just what you can do with fresh food and different things that you can do, not just, from an American perspective, but other cultures were connected to that. And it was really, really a helpful little recipe book that we passed out.
It's actually a really good practice for food recovery organizations to, if you're using volunteers as a staff person to go participate in some of the distributions, because you really get a sense of what's happening. I actually remember at one of the locations, and I can't remember which site this was. There were coconuts. We were doing
Hmm.
coconuts, and let me tell you, the response was, "What am I going to do with those things? They're
Exactly.
hard as a
Yeah.
rock. They're like,
Yeah.
this is pointless." And there was a woman who'd grown up in the Caribbean,
Hmm.
started giving a class on how you prepare coconut. And,
Hmm.
again, it's that the lore of food and how food works in our lives, and sharing that with your neighbors, and then getting to experience a new type of food, a new culture, it's really powerful. So
Hmm.
I strongly suggest that as you're starting a food rescue, you get out there and you kind of see what's happening as this food is being distributed.
Hmm. And introducing types of food that are not traditional types like avocado, like Brussels sprouts, and things of that nature that aren't typical things that people buy, or people shy away from things just because either they don't like what they look like, or they just don't know what they are. And I mean, I'm a classic example. I didn't eat Brussels sprouts because I just was scared of them. Growing up, I thought they were cabbages that hadn't, been fully grown, and so I wouldn't eat them. It wasn't until somebody said to me, "No, you got to try these roasted Brussels sprouts," and I tried. I was like, "Why am I?" I told my mother, I said, I was missing out on Brussels sprouts," and she's like, "I didn't like them growing up because they only boiled them
It boiled them,
when
boiled
they
Brussels
were
sprouts are the
kids." And so she
worst.
said, "I wouldn't give them to you guys." Okay, well, it's a new way to do them now. And it's really cool when you see that. And you're like, I was like, oh, I'm missing out on Brussels sprouts. I love them now. I don't want them boiled, but
No,
I know a different way to make them because
yeah.
somebody introduced me to a different way. Mhm.
Which brings up another good point as well, is that if you have either a strong um, community of volunteers at a site, or your staff is there that's able to experiment a little bit with different
Mhm.
types of food. And, absolutely culturally appropriate food is super important in making sure that folks have access to that. But you can also experiment and say, like, hey, I know this avocado is kind of weird, but you might like it if you do this with it. Or, the Brussels sprouts, you've never had one, or you've only had them boiled, try doing it this way. And
Mhm.
you can actually find out that there's a broader market for those types of foods that folks would, otherwise turn away. But then also being responsive if they're like, we came back, we hated it, we don't want this in our community anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, you find somewhere else for
And
it.
the other thing that 412 did, and I just remember, you also inserted recipes inside of, so that way, when you do get something that you just don't know how to cook or it looks weird, you get a roadmap. I mean, I know you can go on your smartphone or internet or whatever, but getting a handheld recipe
Yeah.
sometimes really helps people, and they're like, "Oh, wait a minute, I have the recipe right here. Let me try it," and they'll try it.
So, and also understanding how to make something taste good without ingredients somebody may not have. So, how do you make
Exactly.
Brussels sprouts taste good if you don't have,
Hmm.
like, golden raisins and pine nuts and bacon? Like, because you might look on the internet, nobody's going to tell you how to just make plain old good
Brussels
roasted
sprouts. Yeah.
Brussels sprouts, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
going to be hard to find. So, coming up with recipes that are easy to follow for those foods.
Hmm.
And so I think the value to this, the understanding, actually, if you can go ahead, uh, go, this is that quote. We've ended hunger in HACP communities. This gets me every time. I get chills. That in itself is super powerful.
Hmm.
But even beyond that, Sedona, you can not only are these partnerships really good because they help you distribute your food, they also demonstrate the value of food recovery better than just about anything else. And if you are starting a food recovery organization, what you need is funding. You're going to need funding. You need to be able to tell your story to get funding, to get donations from your volunteers, to get volunteers. Being able to talk about why food rescue is different, The and, not the or, but different from the existing charitable food system is crucial. If
Mhm.
you cannot show how food recovery is additive to the community, you're going to have a hard time pitching it as something that people should support. And the partnerships with housing have been some of the most valuable partnerships for us in our ability to talk about what the impact of food recovery is. Starting with looking at the data, right? So, how many non traditional sites do you serve? How many places do you serve that are not food pantries, that are different access points? And how can you tell how food recovery increases food access for communities, right? So again, thinking about what does food access means? It means being able to afford, being able to have get to food, being able to get food home, right? If you have to take the bus and you are
Yep.
older and disabled, you can't carry more
Mhm.
than a bag of food, and it takes you 2 hours on the bus. Food is not accessible. If you've got food downstairs in your community room, it changes what food access looks like. So gather that data, start talking about the non-traditional sites that you serve. How many do you serve? And then how can you parse that to look at the impact on your community? Use GIS and other tools to map out new areas of food access. Where is there not a food pantry that now is receiving food that wasn't receiving it before? How many more people are within a 15-minute, walking distance of food, or a zero walking distance of food, right? So collect that data and be able to talk about how food recovery is changing what the charitable food system looks like, what food access looks like in your community. And then the icing on the cake, and no less important, is those stories that you're talking about. It is getting that qualitative data to show what it actually means in action to distribute food to places like your housing communities, your Head Start programs, your job training, your veterans. One story we have from a job training program is that, they saw their attendance go way up when they started having food for people because they weren't just coming for school, they were also coming and being able to get food, get dinner while they were there, take home something for their families. You need to understand what it means for people to be able to access food in those ways. Collect those stories, ask for that impact. If you're not, hearing them organically, go out into the field, watch, collect, ask, and then weave that into your narrative. And all of this should be woven into your narrative because it's really, really important, both in terms of the actual impact it has on the community, which I would argue is transformative, but also in terms of what it provides you as an organization to be able to tell your story. So I think it's really critical to as you're thinking about what that distribution network is going to look like, to think about how it can be something that isn't just a matter of survival because you can get rid of those 10,000 pounds of cucumbers, but also something that is going to help build the story. So with that, we're going to go over to questions. Let's get to the next month's class. Well, okay, well, let's just do that. We'll get the bookkeeping out of the way, what we've got next, then we'll go to questions. So next month, we're going to talk about that is still this month's. Look at that.
Mhm.
Well, we did not change out the slide for the How to Start a Food Rescue webinar next month, and I don't remember what it is. But we're also our sort of regular, sort of advanced food recovery webinar is going to be talking about data and how data, knowing your data, understanding your data, can help you increase your efficiency as a food recovery organization without necessarily increasing your payroll. And we have our Director of Data Analytics, Sean Hudson, who will be delivering that. And he is brilliant and always has really incredible insight. With that, I think you can stop sharing your screen, Sedona, and I will take a look at the questions. What numbers are you referring to when you're talking about selling this idea to housing administration? Michelle, I think you had mentioned that, you try to have a demonstration project.
Mhm.
One of your sites, you go get the residents on board. And then, as you're talking to your administration and wanting to expand it, you take them information and numbers. What type of data can you collect that would be valuable?
So the data that we actually provide our board every month is the amount of food that we get from 412. And they break it down, pounds of food, how many meals it would actually serve, how many locations receive the food. That's valuable data for our board of directors to be able to look at, and just the impact and how many residents, participated in the food drop as it relates to the communities that we serve. And like I said, we have about 10, so we have 20,000 residents totally on two different ends. And one is the low income public housing, and the other one is the Section 8 side. And so there are 20,000. So the 10,000 residents are the residents that I'm talking about as it relates to various high rises and family. But then 412 figured out a mechanism to address those scattered individuals as well. And so that was really cool. The other thing that I think both Jen and I forgot to just talk about is the fact that the food comes right to you. If 412 Food Rescue could be what you call Uber Eats or Amazon, they would be, because they really came up with this whole concept before those folks came up with door-to-door delivery service. And so when it comes right to your door, if you've ever ordered anything from Amazon or from an Uber Eats, it's just much more convenient. But the other thing that happens, it's convenient, but it's also free. And so, of course, convenience and free, when you put those two together, I can guarantee people are going to radiate, to your program just because of that. Food banks tend to, and I'm not discounting a food bank, but you usually have to get to them, and you have to bring the food from wherever they are to where you are. Whereas if the food is right at your back door, right in your basement of the building or in your community room, I mean, literally, you can make a couple trips up and down if it's too much food for you to be able to carry. And you want seniors and other persons, they don't have a problem with that. You can have the kids, assist you to carry it right up the street. For
Yeah.
a food bank, you've got to go out of your way.
So, and again, getting back to understanding what's important, right?
Mm-hmm.
To your audience. As
Mm-hmm.
you're talking to a potential partner at a housing site or at a job training or program, what metrics are they interested in, right? What are the type of things that you can share with them or that they can expect to come from it? They might have sustainability goals, right? And then being able to talk about the greenhouse gas impact could be important. Talking about the value. A lot of nonprofits have to talk about, they received this many donations, they got this in kind donation, and that food has a value. So really understanding what it is that is important to them and being able to quantify that for them, because everybody has to report to somebody, right? Everybody has to report to somebody, and they have to be able to go back to whoever they report to and say, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. These are is the value of this service, and this is why this is important for us to spend our work time on.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the next question, can you share an example of your pitch to potential distribution partners who are unfamiliar with gleaning food rescue? I find it so hard to describe, especially because we meet the needs of the location and so don't really have a typical distribution site. Though through experience, have learned most distribution partners don't get it until I show up with 100 pounds of fruit. So, yeah, it is hard to get until somebody shows up with 100 pounds of fruit and sees it. I think, again, to Michelle's point, understanding what their needs are, and then instead of just giving them a blanket, boilerplate pitch, talking about how you're going to meet their needs.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What's important to that community? What's important to that organization? Um,
I think the first pitch that we received was a phone call talking about what 412 was going to do. The housing authority gets a lot of phone calls from people who always have really great ideas. And then after they tell us about the great idea, they'll ask us, well, how much money can you contribute to this program or process? And I'm holding the phone and I'm listening to, the pitch about 412, and they're going to bring, food, fresh food, and all of this stuff. And never did I get that question about how much money. All they kept saying was, how many people do you think we could serve? And just starting small, and I forget the high rise that we started, starting there. Do you think we'll get everybody? And I'm thinking, what's the catch? And there was no catch. And so I said, oh, okay, we'll try it. This sounds like a great idea. Let's try it. And that's how we did it. We did it a couple of times in that one location. That was Carrick, man. I'm thinking about it. And the next thing I know, the person from the location tells everybody else what's going on. And she has some pictures, and everybody's like, when can they come to my area? And that's how we use her as a good marketing tool, for us to be able to sell it to other residents in other locations. Mm-hmm.
I guarantee you, when I asked you how many people we could serve, I was thinking about, can I get rid of this whole truck of food?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was not actually, I'm sorry, but I probably wasn't thinking about your needs so much at that moment.
Yeah, oh
I can
yeah,
hear,
yeah, like, oh yeah.
I have so many cucumbers.
It was so
Um,
many, yeah, but it was
yeah,
good.
yeah. Yeah, so again, Lisa, it's so hard to describe it, because a lot of organizations, a lot of people that work for nonprofits are conditioned to expect one thing, and you're really offering them something different.
Mm-hmm.
And so honestly, my pitch is usually, let's try it once and see how it goes,
Yep.
right? And you show up that first time with a bunch of fresh fruit or milk or whatever it is, and the light bulb goes off and they can start to really understand the impact it's going to have. So, and then of course word gets around and people hear about it, and you've got pictures and you've got data, and it's a little bit easier to tell the story at that point after you get started.
Mm-hmm.
Um, who are the organizations you are referring to? As you're referring to the entity that works, are you referring to the entity that works with the housing authority? Could you list out all the stakeholders involved? Bella, I'm not quite sure what I said that caused you to ask that. Um, I suspect when I talk about organizations, if it was me, I was talking about the variety of different nonprofits that we work with, because housing authorities are only one. We work with other subsidized and low income housing sites. We work with Head Start programs. We work with job training programs. We work with just any program at all. We are open to working with if they're serving people who are food insecure. And so that's usually what I refer to when I'm talking about organizations. And who the stakeholders are in those is really going to vary depending on the type of org. Have any of your encounters become violent or chaotic? And if so, how did you handle it, or how did you plan to handle it?
Mm. So we've had no violent, knock on wood, we've had no violent encounters. Chaotic from the standpoint of, once people see that it's free, oh yeah, and that's with anything. And so we, the housing authority, and also the residents, had to come up with a mechanism to make sure that we made sure that people came in a orderly fashion. And then they took, everything, as opposed to, because greed just runs rampant and it's free, and people think that they can take a whole bunch of stuff and they really don't need it, but they're just taking it because it's free. And we had to kind of, in the beginning, figure out a monitoring mechanism to be able to say, hey, you don't need, a whole bushel of apples, it's only you, and you don't even have any siblings or any kids or anybody living with you. And so in the senior building, and in particular, and unfortunately, seniors tend to be hoarders, for lack of a better term. And so of course, yeah, and or people who are insecure feel like, I'm going to take a whole lot because this may be the last meal that I get. And
Yep.
so I need to make sure that they have a lot. And so what we did internally was just came up with a mechanism to make it fair. And so that's what we started to do. And our staff was at every location in the beginning, or either the tenant leadership was there in the beginning to make sure it is fair. And yeah, now it's smooth. I mean, we have no problems, but in the very beginning, yeah, because it's free stuff. I mean, if you go to any of these, fairs or whatever, and there's a bunch of stuff, people just line up to get it because they don't want it. It's just because it's free.
Yeah.
But we had to explain that to folks. This is food and it's free. It's an abundance of it, but you want to be able to utilize it, and save some for your neighbor.
And I'll tell you that the more you come back, the more they trust
Mm,
that this is not a resource that's going to disappear. And
mhm.
so having consistency and building that trust over time will also help reduce some of that potential tension in the giveaways. I've never seen anything become too out of control at any of our
Mhm.
institutions. So it's just about managing it and letting everybody know that they're going to get something and it's going to be fair. Um, okay. Would you say that these food drop-offs are similar to no cost market where we take food and people just grab what they need and want? Sometimes. And I can, maybe Michelle, you can talk about different iterations of the program. Sometimes it's like that, but sometimes it's a little bit more organized.
Yeah, it just depends. If we have a food drop in connection with, say, a community day or something of that nature, yeah, people may take more. The more structured food drops, like 412 is coming every Tuesday at 2 o'clock or something like that. People will show up and they will just kind of fall in line with the structured environment. Some things that we have learned, both of us through the years, there were bags. And so now a lot of this stuff is, well, COVID really pushed us to bag things. And so now you're not, just willy nilly grabbing like you were before. It's already bagged. And so you may get more than one bag. But you got to be able to transport at least up the street, and so that actually created a good dynamic, because before it was kind of a grab and go, or either you had somebody who was packing it for you. And that was another thing that was really cool, was tenant leadership. Our staff and volunteers would pack, the stuff for you right there. It was like going to the grocery store, picking out what you wanted, and somebody would pack it for you. So the chaotic instance went down because you had
Yeah.
somebody really saying, "Oh no, that's it. That's enough, Mister So and So," or you've got enough. And we know the consistency makes it so that we know who's using the food, who's giving the food away to other folks other than them, who's just taking food and hoarding it. We know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, the thing I think to remember is there's no right answer. There may be a few wrong ones, but there really is no right answer. You can do it whatever way works for you, your
Mm-hmm.
organization, and your distribution partners. And it can change over time. Like our grocery bagging program that we do with you right now is fairly sophisticated. And we did not start there. We got there after years of working together and
Mm-hmm.
during COVID and with an investment from an outside, donor. So like it doesn't have to look like that. You can still do it without it being that formalized and sophisticated. A grab and go market or a market, where people are tenant councils packing the bags, that works too. So it's just kind of a matter of figuring out what is going to work at the right time and place. And we are just about out of time. There's two more questions I want to just touch on very quickly. One was asking about the GIS study. We actually have the GIS study that we did on our website, our 412 Food Rescue website, which you can take a look at. And there's a little bit in there about methodology, but if anyone's interested in talking about that a little bit more, I can answer that via email. And then there was a question about how do you capture feedback? And I wondered if you could just mention quickly on how you get feedback from the community on this.
So we have a number of mechanisms for feedback. We do surveys. It's really cool because, of course, we'll do a survey right there on site, or we will put something in the bags now, that you can write what you like, what you didn't like. We also had stakeholder and resident feedback groups, and we would do that a lot, and we still do. because that's how we found out one area had too many bananas, or we came up with it. Remember the bags, and folks were like, "Ah, I don't have a bag," and so we came up with a mechanism. Let's have some reusable bags. And so we initially 412 had some, and then somebody else donated, and we figured out how to do that. So we have tenant group meetings. They have resident council meetings every month, but we also just had a big stakeholder meeting, and just a resident meeting with 412, to talk. And 412 initiated a nice couple of workshops here and there, and our residents would go there. They got all the feedback, what to do, what worked, what didn't work. We do that constantly.
Yeah. And I'll say for what we've also done in the past is worked with researchers at the University of Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And so academic researchers always have students, grad students, undergrad students that have to do some sort of project. And so designing a feedback survey and working to implement that within a broad swath of your nonprofit partners is a great way to get information. With that, we're out of time.
Correct.
Yeah, I know I could talk to you all day,
Uh,
Michelle.
me,
The webinar for next month is marketing must-have. So how to market your program to get volunteers, to get publicity without a huge budget. So that's going to be really a good one. I want to say thank you so much for being here, Michelle. I always learn from you, and I appreciate you taking time to share your information and your stories with our participants today.
Thank you, everyone. It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.